Shalom. Welcome to Through the Book of Galatians. We are on lesson 3, starting in chapter 4, verse 1. And you really need to watch the first 2 lessons before you really get into lesson 3, because in lesson 3 we build upon foundation. We assume you already know some things that we covered, but just a quick review is that in the book of Galatians, Paul is responding to the arguments that are put forth in a Dead Sea Scroll document known as 4QMMT, or Some of the Works of the Law. And in the document Some of the Works of the Law, the Essenes are making an argument against the Pharisaic halakha to an unknown party, perhaps to a multitude of parties. The text of 4QMMT is a letter, like Galatians is a letter, similar to Galatians, which is making. There's 3 parties in the book of Galatians. There's I or we, i.e. Paul. There is you, the Galatians, and at times we'll find out that you has a particular meaning in the book of Galatians. And then there is a third party, a they, if you will, those that are disturbing you. Okay, there's a third party that has an alternate point of view that Paul is speaking out against. Same thing is true of 4QMMT. In 4QMMT, there is there is an I or we, i.e. the Essenes, the first person. There's a second person, the person that's being addressed, or the group that's being addressed. We don't know who they are. And then the they that are being spoken of or spoken against are the Pharisees. So when we bring these all together, of course, 4QMMT is older than the book of Galatians. So the original target of 4QMMT was not the Galatians, but I think 4QMMT was written to a variety of targets, if you will. It was written to be almost like a pamphlet to the general public, to those who were neither Essenes yet nor Pharisees, or perhaps they were Pharisees also, but whom the Essenes were evangelizing, if you will, to bring out of, either win over from Phariseeism, or either because they were Pharisees or were being drawn to Phariseeism, or perhaps were trying to gain allies against the Pharisees. And so a document like that was sent, similar to 4QMMT, if not 4QMMT almost verbatim itself, had been sent to the Galatians. So Paul is now writing his book, his letter to the Galatians, and he's responding. And he's responding against the works of the law doctrine, and the under the law doctrine, which is closely associated with, if not identical to, the works of the law doctrine. And so we get to Galatians chapter 4. Paul says, "But I say that as long as the heir is a child, he is not separate from the servants, while he is master of all. But he is under guardians and masters until the time which his father has set. Thus also we were babes. While we were babes, we were subject to the elements of the world. But when came the faithfulness of the time, Eloah sent his son, and he was from a woman, and was under the law." Now here we read the phrase "under the law" in a different sense, if you will. Wherever Paul uses the phrase "under the law," and we discussed this previously, the phrase "under the law" is something that Paul uses to describe something that is antipathy to under grace. Under the law is a doctrine whereby one earns salvation through Torah observance, through a subservience to the Torah. It places the Torah in a higher position than man. And it was the position of Paul's opponents, the authors of, for example, the Damascus document, who taught that it was better to let a man die than it was to violate the Sabbath in order to save a human life, which is, by the way, the opposite of the Pharisaic position and the opposite of Yeshua's position. But it's a position that puts the Torah in a position above a man. By contrast, the Pharisees, for example, saw man's value as being higher than the value of the Torah, as did Yeshua. Okay, so here in verse 4 we see under the law used to refer to the Messiah. So in the past, earlier we said under the law is a false theology that was never true, as it was used in Galatians 3:23. Actually, it's not used in 3:23 in the Aramaic, it is in the Greek. And it is used in Galatians 4 verses 4 through 5, that those that are under the law he might purchase, and we might receive the adoption of sons. Now, I believe Paul here is using the phrase under the law in Galatians 4 through 5 in a sort of an ironic way. What he is doing is he's addressing the Galatians, and he's saying, you want to be under the law, you want to teach this under the law theology, this under the law doctrine, you can't earn your salvation. But I will tell you about one guy who really was under the law. He really did earn salvation. The Messiah. Yeshua was the one person who did actually earn salvation. And so what is this under the law doctrine? We mentioned this, I believe, last week, but we'll cover it again just to be sure. In fact, we have a handout that says under the law at the top. And it points out Paul is the, we definitely covered this in our Romans class. Paul uses this phrase under the law, and it's only in his letters, and only in 3 of his letters, in Romans, 1 Corinthians, and Galatians. There's 3 places where under the law appears in the Greek text where it's not in the Aramaic text. That's Romans 3:19, 1 Corinthians 9:21, and Galatians 3:23. The definitive text for understanding what under the law means is Romans 6:14 through 15. For sin shall not have dominion over you, for you are not under the law but under grace. What then? Shall we sin because we are not under the law but under grace? God forbid. That's according to the King James Version. Okay, so the idea here is that the law, the phrase under the law, refers to something that is in contrast to being under grace. They're diametrically opposed here. They're dichotomous. You cannot be both in terms of the way Paul is using them in Romans 6:14 through 15. And since they are diametrically opposed, they're mutually exclusive. And like I said, you cannot be both. Now this proves that we've always been under grace, always. No man could ever earn his salvation, not even in so-called Old Testament times. So that proves that in fact when Paul uses the phrase under the law, he is not using it to refer to an obsolete Old Testament system. Paul uses the phrase under the law to refer to a false theology that was never true, just as the phrase works of the law is used. Okay? And he uses it in much the same way that a Baptist preacher might use the phrase Latter-day Saints. If a Baptist preacher was speaking out against the theology of Latter-day Saints, or the baptism of Latter-day Saints, somebody that did not understand the theological terminology of the 20th or 21st centuries might misunderstand and might turn around and say, well, what does this Baptist preacher have against believers in the last days? But he's not actually referring to believers in the last days. He's not using the words in their literal, simple, normal meaning of the, verbatim, but rather he's using them as a technical, theological term used by his opponent. And so that identifies his opponent's theology. And that's the way Paul is using the phrase under the law and the phrase works of the law. They refer to a false theology was never true. That's going to become important further down in chapter 3 of the book of Galatians. Verse 6, now because you are sons, Eloah sent the Spirit of his Son to your hearts, which calls the Father our Father, or calls the Father Abba. Abba. Now that's important because that's an Aramaic word, and it gets transliterated into the Greek version of the book of Galatians. It's not the Aramaic version, of course, just says Abba because it's Abba. Okay, but the Greek translator felt a need to not only transliterate the actual Aramaic word that Paul used, but translate it then also into Greek. That, of course, is evidence, fairly minor evidence in the grand scheme of things, but evidence that the book of Galatians was written in Aramaic, not Greek. Some people that will allege that the book of Galatians was written in Greek will say, well, Paul wrote his letters in Greek because he wrote it in the language of the people of the time. If that's the case, then he would have written the Galatians in Gaulish, not Greek, and he would have written the Romans in Latin rather than Greek. But Paul wrote his letters in Hebrew and in Aramaic. Okay, verse 7. From now on, you are not servants, but sons. And if sons, then also heirs of Elohim by the hand of Yeshua the Messiah. This is, by the way, how it is that we are saved. And Paul talks about this more in the book of Hebrews, and we'll cover it in more detail when we do our teaching on the book of Hebrews, when we go lesson through the book of Hebrews. But to summarize simply, our salvation is an inheritance process because of a covenant. And the covenant comes with it inheritance. An example of this is how David became king of Israel. When Samuel anointed David to become king of Israel, he did not just, David was confused at the time. He's like, I'm not even from the right house. How can I become king of Israel? And David later, when as the time went on, he refused to come against Saul, and he said, I won't come against the Lord's anointed, or Yahweh's anointed. So he was not willing to violate the law and the protocol concerning the heirship of the king and the king who was legitimately had claim to the throne as the king of Israel, and in particular Saul's claim. So that being the case, one might ask, how did he become a king of Israel? When Saul died, shouldn't Saul's heir have become king, not David? Why would David violate his principle after Saul died, but not before Saul died? And the answer is this. When David entered into a covenant with Jonathan, Saul's son Jonathan, David and Jonathan became joint heirs. And as joint heirs, that means that David was Jonathan's joint heir. So when Saul and Jonathan were both killed in battle on the same day, David, as Jonathan's joint heir, had a legitimate heirship to the throne. You see, David became the king of Israel because he had a covenant with the son of the king. And when the son of the king died, as his joint heir, he inherited. And that is a picture of our salvation. It's an heirship process, and that's what Paul refers to here. Verse 8. For when you did not know Eloah, you served those that from their nature are not Eloah. So he's saying, before you were followers of Elohim. He's not talking to people that were formerly in Rabbinic Judaism or formerly in Pharisaic Judaism or even formerly in Essene or Sadducean Judaism. They weren't formerly in any form of Judaism whatsoever. These people that Paul is writing to had been pagans. They're Galatians, and we talked about the fact that they were of the lost 10 tribes, but the ones here, at least, that he's addressing in this verse had come from a pagan background. So he says, for then when you did not know Eloah, you served those that from their nature are not Eloah. In other words, they were idolaters. They worship pagan deities. That's apparent from the term those, being plural, that by their nature are not Elohim. But now that you know Elohim, or rather are known from Elohim, in other words, we really can't know Elohim completely because he's infinite, but he knows us. You have again returned concerning those weak and poor elements, and again desire to be made subject to them. In other words, you're returning back to your idolatry. Verse 10 is very important. Days and months and times and years you observe. I fear lest vainly I have labored among you. This is referring to the pagan holidays which they had observed in the past. There's two layers of meaning here, I believe. One is that I believe at this time in the first century there were already those who were in the movement that had come from pagan backgrounds that did not want to give up their old pagan holidays that they had warm, fuzzy feelings about and they'd grown up with in their childhood. They didn't want to give up Saturnalia, the Feast of Venus and whatnot, and so they continued those. They were trying to bring those festivals into the movement, and the problem was, of course, they have no place there. So they were trying to bring they succeeded. We know these things now as Christmas and Easter and other pagan holidays that have been brought over and Christianized, or made messianic. The Jews for Jesus came out with a little pamphlet that says Christmas is a Jewish holiday. And David Stern, in his commentary to these verses, ignores the obvious and insists that these are not talking about Christmas and Easter, but clearly they are. Another element that may be addressed here is because the Essenes, and particularly 4Q MMT, has attached to it a calendar document, had a alternate solar calendar, which agreed with, in its generalities, with the solar calendar that was used by sun-worshipping pagans. And so that may be another element of days and months and times and years you observe, referring to this solar calendar. I fear lest vainly I have labored among you, because I also have become like you, my brothers, I urge you, in nothing have you offended me. This may refer to the fact that he had spent 3 years in Damascus amongst the members of the Way, becoming part of the Way, and therefore entering, if you will, to a certain degree, at least, the Essene sect. We talked about that in lesson 1. Become like me, because I also have become like you, my brothers. I urge you, in nothing have you offended me, for you know that in the weakness of my flesh I declared the good news to you from before. And the temptation of my flesh you will not despise, and did not reject. but like a messenger of Eloah, you received me like Yeshua the Messiah. Therefore, where is your blessedness? For I testify concerning you that if it had been possible, you could have plucked your eyes and given them to me. There's a lot of indications in Paul's letters that his thorn in the flesh that he speaks of at certain times was a problem with his eyesight. Paul talks about writing with large letters. Here he talks about they would pluck their eyes and give them to him. This appears to be this thorn in the flesh, this difficulty that he dealt with. And so that's what he's saying here. Verse 16, have I become an enemy to you because I have proclaimed to you the truth? That's a really important verse. You know, never will you make such an enemy of people as when you tell the truth. When you teach truth, you will make a lot of enemies. Believe me, I have many, many enemies out there because I'm teaching truths and they don't have the response to those truths. So some of them may be KJV only people. Some of them are Greek worshipers, if you will. Some of them are mainline Christians, evangelicals that don't like what I teach. Some of them are rabbinic anti-missionaries that don't like that I teach Yeshua as the Messiah. Some of them teach polygamy and don't like the fact that I teach monogamy. And so when you teach the truth, you get a lot of enemies. Verse 17, they are not zealous of you to good, but they desire to confine you that you might be zealous by them. Now it is good that you be zealous by good things at all times, and not when I am with you only. In other words, you should be zealous all the time, not just because you're influenced by me. You are my sons, those for whom again I labor in birth until the Messiah is formed in you. Now I desire to be with you now, and to change my voice, because I am astonished at you. We might say, raise my voice. Say to me, you who desire that you be, verse 21 begins a very important section. In fact, this brings us to our next handout. Is there profit in circumcision? Galatians 4:21 through 5:2. This is a turning point in Paul's letter, and it's very important to read it carefully and properly, which is why we have this handout to help. Because there appears to be a contradiction between Galatians 5:2 and Romans 3:1 through 2. Galatians 5:2 says, behold, I, Paul, say to you, that if you were circumcised, then the Messiah is a thing which does not profit you. That's Galatians 5:2. But if you look over on your chart next to that, to the believer, it says, therefore, what is the advantage of the Jew, or what is the profit of circumcision? Much in every way. Now, do these passages contradict each other? And the answer is no, they do not. But you must understand the context of both verses. Now, we cover the context of Romans 3:1 through 2, and context of the rest of Romans, and through the book of Romans, which you should also watch. That's a set of, I believe, 5 videos, teachings that take you through the book of Romans. But here we are in Galatians chapter 5, verse 2. We're actually in 4:21 where this begins. So let's start here in chapter 4, verse 21. So to me, you who desire, say to me, you who desire that you be under the law, do you not hear the Torah? Galatians 4:21. Now, we have to ask ourselves a question when we're reading a document, especially a document like Galatians or Romans or even 4Q MMT. Who is the speaker and who is being spoken to? And so the speaker is obviously Paul, speaking as a leader, a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes, as he's called in Acts. And the receiver of the letter, we know as generally as the Galatians, but here is addressed as you. To whom does you specifically refer in, well, we know who you refers to. This will come important later. You is defined here. You say to me, you who desire that you be under the law, do you not hear the Torah? Galatians 4:21. Now, in Galatians 5:2, just a few verses later, now remember the chapter divisions, those were not in the original text. Those were added by monks monkeying with the text long afterwards. Galatians 5:2 says, behold, I, Paul, say to you, that if you were circumcised, then the Messiah is a thing which does not profit you. So we have the word you repeated 3 times here, so it might be important who you is. And Galatians 5:2, who you is defined by chapter 4, verse 21. Say to me, you who desire that you be under the law. But remember, under the law is not an obsolete Old Testament system. We've already determined that under the law was a false theology that was never true, that was held to by Paul's opponents. So Paul is saying to these people who are wanting to follow an apostate system, you who want to be apostates, he's saying your circumcision will profit you nothing. Not that my circumcision won't profit me anything. Not that a believer's circumcision, for a believer, he tells us in Romans 3:1-2, what profit is the circumcision? Much in every way. But for the non-believer, for the apostate, his circumcision will not profit him anything. A Baptist preacher might, by parallel comparison, say today, in reference to a Latter-day Saint, that their baptism will profit them nothing. Okay? So he might say, a Baptist preacher might say, but I, Baptist preachers, say to you Latter-day Saints that if you Latter-day Saints are baptized, the Messiah is a thing which does not profit you. In other words, there's no profit. Your baptism, your Latter-day Saint baptism, won't profit you anything from the Baptist's perspective. Okay? And Paul is saying, similarly, your under the law, works of the law, effort at salvation through circumcision, that circumcision isn't going to benefit you anything. Okay? That does not profit you. There's no profit in that. So, in Galatians 5:2, Paul is addressing the apostate, if you will. In Romans 3:1-2, he's addressing the believer. So then he says, repeating 4:21 again, say to me, you who desire that you be under the law, say to me, you who desire that you be under the law, do you not hear the Torah? So he's going to compare 2 things here. He's going to compare under the law, on the one hand, to the actual Torah on the other, because under the law is not really the Torah. It's a false theology that was never true. It's the position of his opponents. And so he's going to compare these in a chart. In fact, he might have put it in a chart if it had been written in modern format. And so we've broken this down into a chart for you. So beginning of verse 22, for it is written that Avram had to him 2 sons, one from the bondwoman and one from the free woman. But the one that was from the bondwoman was born by the flesh, but the one that was from the free woman was by the promise. Now these are allegories of 2 covenants. One that is from Mount Sinai bears servitude, which is Hagar. For Hagar is the mountain of Sinai, which is in Arabia, and fulfills to this Yerushalayim, or Jerusalem, and serves in servitude she and her sons. but that Yerushalayim is the free woman who is our mother. For it is written, take delight, barren one, who bears not, and rejoice, and shout, you who have not labored in birth, because that many are the sons of the desolate one, more than the sons of the married one. That is Isaiah 54:1. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. But we, my brothers, like Yitzhak, are sons of the promise, and like them, he was born by the flesh, persecuted the one of the Spirit, thus also now. But what does the Scripture say? Cast out the bondwoman and her son, because the son of the bondwoman will not inherit with the son of the free woman. That's Genesis 21:10. Therefore, my brothers, we are not sons of the bondwoman, but sons of the free woman. Chapter 5, verse 1. Stand therefore in the freedom with which Messiah freed us, and do not be bound again by the yoke of servitude. That should not be separated by a chapter division for the previous verse. The thought is continuing. In fact, first thing is stand therefore. It's a conclusion drawn from the previous statements. Behold, I, Paul, say to you, that if you were circumcised, then the Messiah is a thing which does not profit you. Okay, now let's go back to our chart, and we can see how this breaks down. Under the law column, we have two columns, under the law and the Torah. In the under the law column, it says, son of the bondwoman, referring to Ishmael. And in the Torah column, it says, by contrast, son of the free woman, i.e. Isaac. And then in the under the law column, we have covenant at Sinai in Arabia. Now, in the other column, by implication, Paul doesn't say it, but the implication is the covenant at Mount Nebo in Israel. Okay, and we'll talk about that in a minute. We've got a lot to elaborate on here because this is so misunderstood, but it starts to make sense now as we look at it in the chart. Bears servitude, Hagar, in the under the law column, in other words, under the law, bears servitude and parallels Hagar. Whereas the Torah bears freedom and parallels Sarah. Under the law parallels this Jerusalem, and we're going to find out more about that in just a minute when we talk about Isaiah 54:1. And then we have Jerusalem above, which contrasts this and parallels of the Torah, and Galatians 4:26. Then we have cast out. The under the law are cast out in Galatians 4:30. That's why their circumcision doesn't profit them anything. They're cast out. But by contrast, those in regards to the Torah and the Torah column inherit. And then we get to Galatians 5:1. Those that are in the under the law column are bound again by the yoke of servitude. So their circumcision profits them nothing. But by contrast, in Galatians 5:1, the Torah is the freedom with which Messiah has made us free. Okay? So now we see that Paul is contrasting those that are in two different systems. The Torah system, the true Torah system, and the under the law system, which is a false theology that was never true. And he shows us that there's no profit in the circumcision of those that are in this false under the law system because they don't inherit, they're cast out, and they're born of the flesh, and they are bound again by the yoke of servitude. Whereas through the Torah, we are sons of the promise. We have the covenant at Mount Nebo, which we'll talk about in a minute, which bears freedom. We are of Jerusalem above, and we have an inheritance, which is the freedom with which Messiah has made us free, which is the Torah. Okay? All right. Now, let's talk about Galatians 4:27, where it quotes Isaiah 54:1. You'll notice in our chart we have Jerusalem and Jerusalem above contrasted with one another in verses 25 and 26. And then in 27, it quotes Isaiah 54:1. To understand this, let's look at our next handout, which says, Targum Jonathan and Jerusalem above, Galatians 4:27. Now, what are the Targums? The Targums are the Aramaic paraphrases that were used hand in hand with the actual Torah. They would actually, in ancient times, they would read the Torah portion, and then they would read the Targum Onkelos, which was the official Targum for that Torah portion. Then, when they read the half Torah portion, they would read the actual text of, say, Isaiah in this case, and then they would read the Targum Jonathan, which was the official Targum of the book of Isaiah. And the Targum was a paraphrase. It was extremely paraphrased, almost like a commentary. And it would tell what they understood the text to mean. So there's a lot of differences between the Targum and the actual text that are meant to elaborate on the text and explain what the text means, or what it was understood to mean at least. And so we look at Isaiah 54:1, and it says, Sing, O barren, you that did not bear, break forth into singing and cry aloud, you that did not travail, for more are the children of the desolate than the children of the married wife, says Yahweh. Okay? Now let's look at what the Targum says, and then we'll understand why. You see, Paul is making use of Targum Jonathan in his midrash that he is making here in Galatians chapter 4. I told you, we're understanding this text in terms of continuity with Second Temple era Judaism. The Targum Jonathan for this verse will explain to you why he makes reference to this Jerusalem versus Jerusalem above. Isaiah 54:1, Sing, O Jerusalem. Instead of sing, O barren, it identifies the barren as Jerusalem. Sing, O Jerusalem, who was like a barren woman that bears not. That's why Paul identifies Jerusalem with Ishmael here. Okay? Rejoice with praise and be glad, who was like a woman that conceives not. For more shall be the children of Jerusalem that was laid desolate than the inhabitants of the city raised up, says Yahweh. I think actually that may be a little bit mistranslated. The point is that there are two Jerusalems here. There is the Jerusalem that was laid waste, and then there is the Jerusalem that is raised. This raised up Jerusalem, the Aramaic is Roma. Some have mistranslated that as Roman or Rome. And then they've said, oh, it must be wrong, and so sometimes they've translated it and left it out. But I believe here that the Targum talks about the inhabitants of the city raised up. It's talking about Jerusalem that is in ruins versus the future Jerusalem that is raised up, i.e. Jerusalem above. Roma being that which is lifted up or raised up. So Paul here is contrasting, or he's tying in with this idea that's presented in Isaiah chapter 54 of the Targum, which contrasts the Jerusalem that is desolate versus the Jerusalem that is lifted up. Okay, then we get, I want to talk about the covenant at Moab versus the covenant at Nebo. And we have a handout that will help you with that. Here, the covenant at Mount Moab compared to the new covenant. Now, it's important to understand, as we talked about earlier in the book of Galatians, in our teaching in lesson 1, that Paul's Paul's opponent, the Essenes, believe that they are living in the new covenant. They believe the new covenant is their doctrine, if you will. They believe that they all, that their forefathers made a journey to an exodus, if you will, to Damascus, and all entered into the new covenant together, and that this covenant, which binds them together as a community that they call Yachad, centered around their doctrine, which, at least for this particular group, includes the works of the law and under the law doctrines of 4Q MMT. That is the new covenant to them. That is what the new covenant is to them. And that's apparent in the Damascus document and the Manual of Discipline. Both make reference to that covenant as the new covenant. So Paul is making a point here that they're, in his opinion, actually stuck on the covenant at Sinai in Arabia, which is not the new covenant. Because, and this is why we have this chart to compare the new covenant with of Jeremiah 31 with the covenant at Nebo in Deuteronomy 28 verse and 29:1 through chapter 30. And so reading from Deuteronomy 28:69 or 29:1, depending on which text you're looking at, these are the words of the covenant which Yahweh commanded Moshe to make with the children of Israel in the land of Moab. That's where Mount Sinai was. Besides the covenant which he made with them in Horeb. I'm sorry, they're at Moab. This is where Nebo is what I mean. Mount Nebo. Besides the covenant which he made with them in Horeb, which is where Mount Sinai is. Okay? So, in Deuteronomy 29, or 28:69, or 29:1, there is this discussion of a covenant which is made at Mount Nebo, and it parallels the covenant that is made, the new covenant that Jeremiah 31 speaks of. It's not the covenant of Sinai, okay? And it says, by contrast, in Jeremiah 31 through 32, or in parallel, behold, the days come, says Yahweh, that I will make a renewed covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah, not according to the covenant that I will make with their fathers in the day that I took them out by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt, for as much as they broke my covenant, although I was husband over them, says Yahweh. So there, both cases, we're talking about this covenant that is not the same as the covenant that was made at Mount Sinai, and is a renewal of the covenant. Okay, Deuteronomy 30 verses 2 through 6 says, and shall return unto Yahweh your Elohim, and hearken to his voice according to all that I commanded this day, that your children, you and your children, with all your heart and with all your soul, and Yahweh your Elohim shall circumcise your heart, which Paul talked about in Romans, by the way, in parallel, and the heart of your seed, to love Yahweh your Elohim with all your heart and with all your soul, that you may live. Now Jeremiah chapter 32 verse 40 says, but this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, says Yahweh. I will put my Torah in their inward parts, and in their heart I will write it. That's actually Jeremiah 31:22a. And then he says, I will put my fear in their heart, that they shall not depart from me, in Jeremiah 32:40. Okay. The next parallel, Deuteronomy 29:12, or verse 13, depending on which edition you're reading. But that he may establish you this day unto himself for a people, that he may be unto you an Elohim, as he spoke unto you, as he swore unto your fathers, to Abraham, to Yitzhak, and to Yaakov. This is paralleled in Jeremiah 31. I will be their Elohim, and they will be my people, and they shall be my people, and I will be their Elohim. That they're in 32:38. And then it says, and Yahweh your Elohim will turn your captivity and have compassion upon you, and will return and gather you from all the peoples where Yahweh your Elohim has scattered you, and so on and so forth. Again, here the concept of him being their people and keeping the covenant they swore to their fathers. And then in verse 30, chapter Deuteronomy 35, and Yahweh your Elohim will bring you into the land which your fathers possessed, and shall possess it, and he will do you good, and multiply you above your fathers. And likewise, Jeremiah 32:37, and I will bring them back into this place, and I will cause them to dwell safely, and so on. So this is all detail, and much more detail in the chart if you want to look at it. So Paul is taking issue with his opponent's concept of the new covenant. And he's basically saying your so-called new covenant is really just the covenant at Sinai. You haven't really entered into the new covenant. And so let's talk about the this idea of the new covenant as Paul has presented it, and as we read in Romans, which, remember now, Paul started out by sending these people a letter that's essentially the same as Romans. And we know that because in Galatians he makes frequent references back to his arguments in Romans, but he doesn't actually give the complete argument. It's just like he's trying to bring it back to their mind. Remember what I said before. So, and this is so we want to bring here Rabbi Nachman, the Ramban, his commentary on Deuteronomy 29:6, which is in reference to this covenant at Mount Nebo, and also identifies this as the new covenant, but it also identifies it with this circumcision of the heart, and with the same kind of things that Paul talks about in Romans. And Yahweh your, we have a handout for this. It says Messiah overcomes the consequences of the sin of Adam. I think this is the version of it that I have in the Romans handouts. You might read a little bit differently in your Galatians handouts, but it's Rabbi Nachman ben Nachman on Deuteronomy 29:6. And Yahweh your Elohim will circumcise your heart. Deuteronomy 30 verse 6. Remember, Paul talks about circumcision of the heart in Romans. It is this which the rabbis have said, if someone comes to purify himself, they assist him from on high. The verse assures you that you will return to him that if you will return to him with all your heart and with all your soul, with all your heart, he will help you. This following subject is very apparent from Scripture. Since the time of creation, man has had the power to do as he pleased, to be righteous or wicked. This grant of free will applies likewise to the entire Torah period, so that people can gain merit upon choosing the good and punishment for preferring evil. In other words, we're talking about the contrast here between the Yitzer Ra and the Yitzer Tov, the evil inclination and the good inclination. But in the days of Messiah, the choice of their genuine good will be natural, and the heart will not desire the improper, and it will have no craving whatever for it. This is the circumcision mentioned here, for lust and desire are the foreskin of the heart, and the circumcision of the heart means that it will not covet or desire evil. Excellent definition of circumcision of the heart from the Ramban. Man will return at that time to what he was before the sin of Adam, when he, by his nature, did what should properly be done, and there was no conflicting desires in his will, as I have explained in Seder Bereshit. It is this which Scripture states in the book of Jeremiah 31:30, talking about the new covenant. Behold, the days come, says Yahweh, that I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah, not according to the covenant that I made with their fathers, etc. In other words, not the covenant at Sinai. But this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, says the Eternal. I will put my Torah in their inward parts, and in their heart will I write it. This is a reference to the annulment of the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination, and to the natural performance by the heart of its proper function. This is Paul's message. This is Paul's teaching as opposed to 4Q MMT. I mean, Ramban is saying it, but this is Paul's teaching. Wherefore, Jeremiah said further, I will be their Elohim, and they shall be my people, and they shall teach no more every man his neighbor and every man his brother, saying, Know Yahweh, for they shall all know me, from the least of them to the greatest of them. Now it is known that the imagination of man's heart is evil from his youth, and it is necessary to instruct them, but at that time it will not be necessary to instruct them to avoid evil, for their evil instinct will be completely abolished. And so it is declared by Ezekiel, a new heart will I give you, and a new spirit will I put within you, and I will cause you to walk in my statutes. Ezekiel 36:26, which is why Paul talks early in Galatians about what was it that let's see if I can find the passage here. Was it the works of the law, or was it the Holy Spirit, the Ruach HaKodesh, that brought you here? I may not be able to just put my fingers on it because I wasn't planning to go there. But we discussed this earlier, and Paul is reflecting back upon it. Were you justified by the works of the law, or were you justified by the Ruach HaKodesh and the Spirit? Okay. I wasn't planning to go there, so I don't have it in my notes, but we talked about it previously. Okay. The new heart alludes to, back to Ramban, the new heart alludes to man's nature, and the new spirit to the desire and will. It is this which our rabbis have said, and the years draw near when you shall say, I have no pleasure in them. These are the days of Messiah, as they will offer opportunity neither for merit nor for guilt. For in the days of the Messiah there will be no evil desire in man, but he will naturally perform the proper deeds, and therefore there will be neither merit nor guilt in them, for merit and guilt are dependent upon desire. That's the Ramban on Deuteronomy 29:6. Okay, so Paul is then in this midrash. He's comparing the new covenant of the works of the law sect, the Essenes, and particularly the works of the law Essenes and the under the law Essenes. And he's comparing their concept of the new covenant with his own concept of the new covenant. And his own concept of the new covenant is very much like that of Ramban. In fact, it's virtually identical to that which I just read from Ramban. And it is this concept that we talked about in our in so much detail in our Romans study. So if you haven't studied Romans through the book of Romans videos, you should definitely go through them. Okay, so then we go to chapter 5, verse 3. Now I testify again to every son of man that is circumcised, that he is a debtor to all the Torah. In other words, once you become circumcised and you've entered the covenant, the Mosaic covenant, you are then obligated to observe all the commandments of the Torah, because you know what they are. Prior to that, you may not even know what the commandments are. Do a whole teaching on that in our teaching through the book of Acts when we get to Acts 15. So you've, verse 4, you have made the Messiah of no effect. These would be justified by the Torah, and from favor you have fallen. In other words, if you go into this works of the law theology, this under the law theology, and you try and earn your salvation through Torah observance, and by achieving salvation through some level of ritual purity, through something that you can do. See, we're not earning salvation. Paul's teaching is that of Antigonus of Soko in the Mishnah Avot, the first chapter. Antigonus of Soko said, we do not to observe Torah as one who is like a servant seeking a reward, but as a servant who has no thought of a reward. We're not trying to earn salvation, which is Paul's teaching here. We don't earn our salvation. Okay. Verse 5, for we by the Spirit which is from trust await the hope of righteousness. For in the Messiah Yeshua neither is circumcision anything nor uncircumcision, but trust which is perfected by love. Now, this does not mean that we don't get circumcised. It means that we are both circumcised. We are all saved in the same way, which is not via circumcision. Okay? You were running well. Who disturbed you that by the truth you should not be persuaded? Your persuasion is not from one who calls you. A little leaven spoils all the lump. I am confident concerning you and our Don that you will not hearken other things, that you will not think other things, and the one who frightened you will bear to himself judgment, whoever he is. In other words, whoever has been sending you 4QMMT. Now, my brothers, if I was still proclaiming circumcision, why am I persecuted? Has the offense of the gallows not ceased? Now, in context, it's not saying that he's not teaching circumcision at all anymore. The context is salvation. If I was teaching that you could earn salvation through being circumcised. Remember, this is all in context of what he said in chapter 5, verse 2, in context of 4:21, in this whole context of the letter. Now, would that also those troubling you would be cut off. Almost sort of a pun here. He's saying that those who are trying to get you to be circumcised, it's not that Paul doesn't want them to be circumcised, but they're trying to get them circumcised into their Essene cult. He goes, those are trying to get you circumcised or converted into their Essene cult, and trying to convince you that this circumcision into their Essene cult will save you. He would that they would be cut off. There's sort of an implication here of I wish they cut their whole thing off. Now you were called not just circumcise it, but the whole thing. Now you were called to freedom, my brothers, but not let your freedom be an occasion of the flesh, but in love serve one another. In other words, we don't say, oh, well, I'm saved, therefore I don't need to observe Torah. For all the Torah is fulfilled in one word, that you should love your neighbor like yourself. Which is, by the way, devour one another, beware lest one from another you be consumed. But I say by the Spirit walk, and the lust of the flesh never follow. Remember Romans 7:14, which we talked about in the lesson on Romans. The Torah is of the Spirit. I am of the flesh. And this is what Paul is going to talk about in the next few verses of Galatians. He's going to reflect upon this conflict between the two natures, between the Yitzer Ra and the Yitzer Tov, that he spoke about in the book of Romans, that we talked about in our Romans class. I believe particularly Romans chapter 5, if I recall correctly. 5 and 6. 5 and 6. But I say, by the Spirit walk, and the lust of the flesh never follow. In other words, the Spirit, since the Torah is of the Spirit, observe Torah. For the flesh desires a thing which is opposed to the Spirit, and the Spirit desires a thing that is opposed to the flesh, and the two of these are opposed to each other, that you do not do the thing which you desire. This is Paul stating clearly, the conflict between the two natures, which is such a theme in the book of Romans, and he's just referring back to it. This is also the subject of the Tanya of the Rebbe Zalman. The Tanya says in chapter 9, just as two kings wage war over a town, which, and by the way, this is your next handout, the two souls, Galatians 5:17. Zalman, the Rebbe Zalman, wrote in Tanya, which is the foundational work of the Chabad movement, just as two kings wage war over a town which each wishes to capture and rule, that is to say, to dominate its inhabitants according to his will, so that they obey him in all that he decrees for them, so do the two souls, the divine and the vitalizing animal soul, wage war against each other over the body and all of its limbs. So within our bodies, there's these two natures that are fighting for control of our body to get our flesh or get our body to do the thing that they want it to do, either the evil inclination or the good inclination, okay? Or the animal soul and the divine soul fighting within us, okay? The divine soul wants to follow the Yitzer Ra, the Yitzer Tov, and the good inclination, and wants to lead us to observe Torah and do the things that are in keeping with Torah. The evil inclination has influence over the animal soul, the flesh, and it wants to control to our body, to give heed to it and do the things that are not in keeping with the Torah. And so this is what Paul is going to continue to discuss here. Verse 18, for if by the Spirit you are led, then you are not under the law. In other words, I'm going to make my case here. If I'm right in this whole concept that the Ruach is leading you to observe the Torah and to assist you in the battle between the two inclinations to do the right thing, if that's what the new covenant is, like the Ramban taught, which is what Paul is teaching, if that's the theology of the Ramban, it's the theology of the Tanya, it's really the theology of Rabbinic Judaism, the theology of the Tanya, okay, of Hasidism. It is also Paul's theology. It is not the theology of the Essene. I mean, they do talk about the conflict of the two natures, by the way, in the Manual of Discipline, and we can do a whole study on that. But the resolution of earning your way out of that situation through the works of the law is not the solution that Paul accepts. Paul's opposed to that teaching. That's the position of 4QMMT, but that is not Paul's position, and so Paul's going to say, I can prove that's wrong. So I'm going to prove we're not under the law. For the works of the flesh are known, which are fornication, uncleanness, perversion, worship of idols, magic, animosity, or sorcery, you can say instead of magic, animosity, contention over zealousness, anger, insolence, factionalism, and sectarianism, envy, murder, drunkenness, and reveling, and all that are similar to these. So these are the things that the Yitzer Ra, the animal soul, wants to do. And it's voting. There's sort of a conflict taking place within us where it's like a tribunal inside you. You've got the animal soul that wants the fleshly things. You've got the divine soul, the spirit within you that wants to do the Messiah within you that wants to do the right things, to observe Torah. And then you have you. And you vote with one side or the other whenever you make your decision. And whichever one you vote with gets control of your physical body as to what actually gets done in this world, rather than in theory what's just being thought about. Okay? So By contrast, we get to verse 22. But the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, shalom, long-suffering, kindness, goodness, trust, meekness, patience, against which the Torah does not stand. In other words, the Torah is all for these things. The Torah, it guides us in these things because they are of the Spirit. But those who are of the Messiah have crucified their flesh with all its passions and its lust. Therefore let us live by the Spirit, and let us follow the Spirit, and let us not be of empty glory, so we may ridicule one another and envy one another. And we talked about this so much when we covered this in the book of Romans, the resolution of the conflict between these two natures is the Messiah crucified within us, and we went into a great deal of detail of that in Romans chapters 5, 6, 7, and 8. My brothers, if a man from you should be overtaken by fault, those of you that are in the Spirit, in other words, who are Torah observant, because Romans 7:14, the Torah is of the Spirit, should correct him in a meek spirit, and be watchful, lest also you be tempted. And bear one another's burden, that therefore you should fulfill the Torah of Messiah. Some have tried to interpret that to mean something other than the Torah itself, but in fact the Torah of Messiah, I believe, is the Torah. For if a man thinks he is something when he is not, he deceives his nephesh. But let a man examine his work, and then his boasting will be in his nephesh and not in others. For every man shall carry the load of his nephesh, or his soul. Now he that heard should communicate the word to the one who instructed him in all good things. Do not err, and Noah is not mocked. For the thing a son of man sows, that he reaps. And he who sows in the flesh, from the flesh reaps corruption. In other words, if we feed the animal soul, it gets stronger. And he who sows in the Spirit, from the Spirit reaps life eternal. So if we feed the divine soul Torah, which is the food of the divine soul, this is all what the Tanya talks about this in such detail. If we feed the divine soul its food, which is Torah, then it becomes stronger, and it has more sway. Okay, so he who sows in the Spirit, from the Spirit reaps life eternal. And while we do that which is good, we should not be weary, for the time shall come when we shall reap, and we will not be weary. Now, therefore, while we have time, let us do good toward every man, especially toward the sons of the house of faith. See, these writings I have written to you by my hands. Those who want to boast in the flesh urge you to be circumcised, only so they might not be persecuted by the gallows of Messiah. In other words, they're just trying to win you over in a contest, basically. For not even those that are circumcised keep the Torah, but they desire you to be circumcised, that in your flesh they might boast. They might be able to brag that they got more converts for their movement. Remember now, Paul's not saying don't get circumcised. He's telling them don't get circumcised into that false teaching group. For me, I will have nothing to boast about in the gallows of our Adon Yeshua the Messiah, that by him the world was crucified to me, and I was crucified to the world. For circumcision is nothing, nor uncircumcision, but a new creation. You have to understand, when a proselyte becomes a Jew through conversion, at the point of circumcision, they become a new creation. So what Paul is saying, it's like a Baptist preacher might say, it's not baptism or not being baptized, it's becoming a new creature in Christ. That's what a Baptist preacher would say. I'm not agreeing with that, I'm just giving you a parallel. Okay, I'm not agreeing with that terminology or theology or whatever, I'm just saying that that's what a Baptist preacher might say, so you can kind of better understand and put Paul's words in a different, the idea of what Paul is saying in a different atmosphere. So Paul is saying that it's really it's not just the physical act of the circumcision or non-circumcision, but rather the becoming of a new creature, becoming a proselyte, becoming a Jew. And those who follow this path, shalom and mercy be concerning them and concerning the Israel of Eloah. Thus do not let any man pour trouble upon me, for I bear the marks of our Adon Yeshua the Messiah in my body. In other words, I'm circumcised. I bear the marks of our Adon Yeshua the Messiah in my body. So do not let any man trouble you upon me. I'm all for it. Don't say it. It's not because I'm against circumcision. I'm circumcised. I'm saying don't get circumcised into to try and earn your salvation into that works of the law, under the law, Essene group. The favor of our Adon Yeshua the Messiah be with you, your spirit, my brothers. Amen. And that concludes our study of the book of Galatians. I'd like to encourage you to support these studies with your tithes and free will offerings. These teachings are made free on video to you, but they are paid for by those who support this teaching with their tithes and offerings. And these teachings are not supported by Christian denominations, by Rabbinic Judaism. Nobody pays to support these teachings except you, those that benefit from them. So please support these teachings, help make them possible. Please send your tithes and offerings to Nazarene Judaism, P.O. Box 471, Hurst, Texas 76053. That's Nazarene Judaism, P.O. Box 471, Hurst, Texas 76053. Even better, you can send tithes and offerings over the internet instantly via PayPal by going to NazareneSpace.com or to NazareneJudaism.com, and you can click on the PayPal box in the either upper right hand or upper left hand corner. I'm not sure which it is on each of them. I think but if you go ahead and go there and click on the PayPal box, you can send tithes and offerings instantly over the internet. We appreciate that support. It's very important to keep this vision alive, and this is a kind of teaching that you really can't get anywhere. You're not going to get this teaching from the church. You're not going to get this teaching from Rabbinic Judaism. It's a very unique ministry where we are teaching the Ketuvim Netzarim and other writings from a Jewish perspective, from the Hebrew and Aramaic, using Jewish hermeneutics and in continuity with Second Temple era Judaism. So again, please support this work. Thank you, and join us when we continue our studies through the letters of Paul and through the Ketuvim Netzarim. Shalom.